Hi everyone, welcome to the third part of our lecture on abstractness. We've now seen an abstract analysis in action for the first time on the basis of some Spanish data, and now we'll try to work out a further analysis on the basis of some Turkish data. So these data come from some papers by Inklis. Unfortunately, the glosses are missing there. So we'll carry out the usual procedure of first trying to divide up the words in the data into morphemes, carrying out the morphological analysis, and we'll identify alternating morphemes. And I'll suggest here that we start with the nominative and accusative forms and see first there what the alternations are, and then after we've identified some problems, we can try to turn to the professional forms and try to look at alternations in vowel length as well. And what we'll see, just as we saw in Spanish, is that when we try to choose underlying representations for some of our morphemes, we'll run into the problem that choosing either one of the possible concrete underlying representations based on the occurring surface forms doesn't easily allow for correctly generating all of the data. So let's begin first by just trying to segment the data morphologically here, looking at the first row, which actually contains two forms. So we have kanat, kanadu, kanadu, and kanatchu, and balad, balado, baladjo. So what I see here is that, and if I look at the accusative forms, all the way down the row of the accusative forms, we've seen Turkish data before in this course, and we know that Turkish, in fact, exhibits vowel harmony. For simplicity here, we've chosen some data that will ensure that there's no vowel harmony applying to the endings. So, of course, our accusative suffix looks to be a suffix can't find the symbol for that high backgrounded vowel at the moment. So here's our morphological rule, which states that a suffix is added when we have when case, that's the value of accusative. And the professional forms we see in the first group, in the first column of professional forms, there's consistently a suffix ch. I think there are a couple of typos where, a couple of typographical errors where we have a w instead of vowel u. And in the other set of forms, we have both j often here, and then also some additional ch. And in general, it looks like we find the suffix, so this professional suffix, let's just say, I'll just say when professional, we won't worry about exactly what this means for the moment. Here we find two allomorphs. We find both ch, chu, and ju. Those are our two allomorphs, and their distribution in the professional forms, the distribution of these two allomorphs looks fairly straightforward. We find the voiceless ch when the immediately preceding consonant is voiceless, so there we have a voiced a voiceless ta or a voiceless ha, and on the other side we find the voiced affricate ja when there's a preceding da or ba, and so on. Now, let's look at them. So as far as we can see in the nominative forms, it looks like there's simply no affix. I won't worry for the moment exactly what the underlying representation is here. The distribution is fairly clear. Whether it should be ch or ja, we can't quite yet say. So when we look at the first three forms in the data, kanat, kanade, kanadu, kanachu, balad, baladu, balaju, baladju, and sanat, sanatu, sanatchu. There we see three different patterns already in the stem. So this first word exhibits allomorphy in its stem form. It has a voiceless ta, but a voiced da before the ending of the accusative. The next two stems, though, show no allomorphy in that regard. They have a voiced obstruent all the time. So both in the nominative and accusative, there's a voiced da in this word. And here in this word, in both the nominative and the accusative, there is a voiced, a voiceless ta. So as we've discussed several times, when we see these sorts of these sorts of consonant voicing alternation patterns, there are two relatively easy possible analyses. One could be to assume devoicing of an underlying voiced obstruent, word finally, and the other alternative would be to assume voicing of the obstruent between, say, syllabic sounds or between sonorant sounds, word internally. But what we find here is that if we choose either a devoicing analysis or a voicing analysis, we will make incorrect predictions for some of the other data. So let's say if we posit the devoicing analysis, so we have a rule just like in Russian or German, which states that a non-sonorant sound would become voiceless at the right edge of the word. So that would imply that the alternating type here, that show words that show an alternation between ta and da, and we should find some similar patterns here. So we find ijab alternating with ijabu, but on the other hand, we find muntehap, which shows some different, which shows also that alternation. But on the other hand, we find words like bap, bapu, which show P all the way through, and words like bab, babu, babu, which show B all the way through. In addition, we have some vowel length alternations, which again, we'll ignore for the moment. Okay, so if we try to apply the devoicing analysis, that would then posit that this word, the first word in the data, has an underlying voiceless stop, and in its nominative form, that it becomes that the segment becomes devoiced. Okay, so far so good. That way we can generate the form kanat and the form kanadu. So the forms of this word can then be generated correctly. But if we take a word which has a consistent underlying voiced stop throughout the paradigm, like this other word, balad, we can generate its accusative form without any serious problems. So its accusative forms will surface as correctly as balad do, but the nominative will be incorrectly predicted to have have a voiceless obstruent. And this is precisely what we don't want to find. We don't want to find a voiceless ta there at the right edge of the word. So this shows us that the devoicing analysis won't work. And if we posit just the opposite, say an analysis which assumes voicing of an underlying voiceless obstruent between vowels, then we will encounter problems with words like that of the stem sanat, because then in the accusative singular, in the accusative forms, the underlying voiceless ta would be predicted to become a da. So that's the essence. That's the essence of the problem that we're encountering here. There are, just as we found in Spanish, there are stems that consistently have one sound that never alternate. So there are stems that have sound A, which never alternate, and there are stems which have sound B, which never alternate. But then there's a third group which shows both of those sounds in alternation with one another. So it's not possible to choose either sound A or sound B for the underlying representation and be able to derive them without having some adverse effects. Now, let's take a moment and perhaps look a little more closely at the professional forms, because what appears interesting here is to see that in the professional forms, we find that in the alternating type here, we have the voiceless allomorph of the professional suffix. And if we look at another alternating form like hijab with a voiceless, again, the voiceless allomorph of the professional suffix occurs there. We only find the voiced allomorph of the professional suffix on stems that have a non-alternating voiced stop, stems like balad or bab throughout the paradigm. So there, that doesn't, one might perhaps try to use that as evidence of what the underlying form for the stem could be. It might lead you to think, the stem must have an underlying voiced stop, and that causes the professional suffix to become voiceless. But it could be just the other way around, namely that the underlying form of the professional suffix is voiceless, that the underlying form is ju, and that forces the consonant at the end of this alternating stem to become voiceless. So it's not immediately clear based on this data what exactly we need to posit for the underlying representation of the professional suffix, and whether we are seeing regressive voicing assimilation of some type or progressive voicing assimilation. If we only had non-alternating stems, then it would look like we would need progressive voicing assimilation. That is, if we only had stems like balad and sanat, then we could choose either chu or ju as the underlying form of the professional suffix and assume that the other allomorph is generated by forward application of voicing assimilation. But it wouldn't really matter which option we choose. So let's return to the problem of the stems and summarize for a moment exactly what this problem is. So we have stems, of course, that always end in P, so those must have an underlying voiceless labial stop. There are stems that always end in a voiced labial stop, so those must always have an underlying voiced labial stop. But there are the stems like, for instance, hijab, hijabu, which show an alternation between pa and ba. And the question is there, well, what can we choose as the underlying form of that suffix? So again, ignoring the problem in vowel length for a moment, in the word bab, the underlying form clearly needs to be bab. For bab, it has to be bab. But in supa or hijab, there we need to have either, there we need some other sound. The solution of Inkless here is to posit some third phoneme that is specified for place, so specified for labial or coronal place, but which has no underlying specification for voice. So the information for this sound, so there would be underlying sounds pa and ba, which are specified for voice as minus voice and plus voice, just as we would expect. But this third sound shares all of the same features with those sounds, being a labial stop, but the voice information is not specified. So in terms of phonemes, what we have, this analysis then assumes that Turkish has 3 phonemes, an underlying phoneme pa, which is always realized as pa, an underlying phoneme ba, which is always realized as ba, and an underlying phoneme, we'll use the capital P to indicate this labial stop phoneme that is not underlyingly specified for voice. That sound has 2 allophones, one allophone pa and another allophone ba. Both possibilities can be filled in. In that regard, we might actually want to, it would be smarter of us to put this phoneme over here, and then we can imagine that this phoneme, the underspecified phoneme, shares an allophone with the underlying voiced stop, and it shares an allophone with the underlying voiceless stop, depending on which values for voicing are filled in. Of course, this is kind of weird to assume that these sounds would be missing some information for some features, and we would need some kind of phonological rule that states under what conditions the sound will be given specifications for voicing. And in particular, if we assume that this underspecification really means 0 voice, then we're going to have a phonological rule that targets rules that are marked as 0 voice. And as I've mentioned in earlier lectures and in our exercise sessions, that's precisely not something that should ever happen. Okay, at this point, now that we've seen the fundamentals of the problem with the Turkish data, take a break, and then we'll come back trying to work out the remainder of the analysis with a few rules.